The memory within the mug. In the towering skyline of Mountain View, California, inside the minimalist yet sleek architecture of Google's headquarters, Sundar Pichai sat by a floor-to-ceiling window, sipping chai from a chipped ceramic mug. It wasn't just any mug, it was one he had carried with him since his early days in Chennai, India. The handle had a faint crack, barely held together with superglue, and a faded cartoon of a smiling sun that had long lost its brightness. But to Sundar, it held memories richer than the aroma of the tea within. On this overcast Thursday morning, Sundar found himself reflective. A major product launch was mere days away, but something deeper tugged at his heart. For all the breakthroughs in AI and innovation he spearheaded, there was a hollowness he couldn't explain. His phone buzzed gently. It was a message from his mother. "Beta, you remember Savitri Amma? I heard from your cousin that she's still working. She's 85 now. Can you believe it? Still cleaning houses." Sundar's chai nearly slipped from his hands. Savitri Amma. Her name hadn't crossed his mind in years, yet the moment he read it, her image emerged crystal clear, wrinkled but smiling, always humming old Tamil lullabies while tidying the small apartment where he grew up. She wasn't just a nanny. She was the silent pillar during his childhood. When his parents left for work, it was Savitri Amma who walked him to school, told him stories by candlelight during power cuts, and held his hand during monsoon storms. He remembered her slender fingers feeding him curd rice on hot afternoons, her sari always smelling faintly of jasmine and soap. And now, she was 85. Still working. Still cleaning. He couldn't shake the image. A woman who had served him with unwavering love was now bending her fragile back to mop someone else's floor. He called his assistant. "Ananya, I need you to find someone for me." "Of course, sir." "Who?" "A woman named Savitri. Savitri Iyer. She used to live near T. Nagar in Chennai. Around 30 years ago." Ananya hesitated. "That's a long time ago." "I know, but it's important. See if you can find her." Meanwhile, in Chennai, the sun was merciless that April afternoon. Streets steamed, and the pavement shimmered like molten glass. In a small two-room house near Kodambakam, Savitri Iyer wrapped her frayed cotton sari tighter around her thin frame. The house was borrowed, the roof patched with tin and plastic sheets, but it was hers, and she kept it spotless. She had just returned from her third job of the day, a modest flat where she mopped floors and washed dishes. Her legs ached constantly now. Her eyesight blurred when she looked too long at bright surfaces, but she had no choice. "My hands still work," she would say. "And God is kind." She didn't know her name had just echoed in the halls of Google. She didn't know her past had caught up with her. She didn't know Sundar Pichai was about to change her life forever. Back in Silicon Valley, 3 days passed. Sundar had buried himself in meetings, rehearsals, and code reviews. But in every quiet moment, his thoughts returned to her. That same evening, as he reviewed presentation notes, Ananya entered his office. "We found her." He looked up, startled. "Where?" "Chennai. She's still working as a housekeeper. Lives in a very modest area. No family to support her." She refused to stop working. A lump formed in his throat. "She wouldn't take charity," Ananya added, reading the next line from her notes. "She told someone she wants to earn her bread until God calls her home." Sundar stood up. "I'm going to Chennai." "Sir, the launch. The team can handle it. This is more important." Sundar's journey back. Returning to India always made Sundar nostalgic, but this trip felt different. It wasn't about media interviews or summits. This was personal. Landing in Chennai's humid embrace, he felt a knot of emotion he hadn't known he still carried. He visited his childhood neighborhood, now congested and unfamiliar. Kids played cricket in the same alleyways, though the buildings had aged, just like the memories they held. And then he saw her, bent at the waist, sweeping a dusty balcony. The same woman who once held his tiny hand was now gripping a broom with trembling fingers. Her white hair was tied in a bun. Her saree clung to her frail frame, soaked in sweat. He watched silently from the car window, heart hammering. Could he just walk up to her? Would she recognize him? He stepped out. The street sounds faded into background noise as he approached her. "Savitri Amma," he called softly. She paused, turned slowly. Her eyes squinted at the tall man before her. "Do I know you, Thambi?" "It's me, Sundar. Sundar from T. Nagar. Remember? You used to call me Cuddy Engineer because I broke the TV remote trying to fix it." A pause. And then tears, laughter, shaking hands covering her mouth. She dropped the broom. Sundar ran to hold her as she swayed slightly. "God has strange ways," she whispered. "I thought you'd forgotten." "I could never forget you, Amma. The beginning of something beautiful." He brought her home that night, to a modest hotel room first, to make her comfortable. But Sundar had bigger plans. The next morning, over fresh idlis and filter coffee, he looked into her eyes. "You're never working again, Amma. From now on, you rest." "But how can I?" "I insist. Let me give you back a little of what you gave me. Let me honor your strength." He didn't just give her money. He built her a house, appointed a caregiver, set up a trust in her name to support other elderly women who had spent their lives in service. When the media caught wind of it, Sundar's office declined to comment. "It's a personal matter," they said. But kindness doesn't go unnoticed. And that was only the beginning. Because what Sundar didn't know was that Savitri Amma had kept something. A letter, a secret, a memory that would open doors Sundar never expected. And as the next chapter of their story unfolded, the world would witness not just a reunion, but a transformation. The forgotten letter. The days that followed their emotional reunion in Chennai unfolded slowly, almost like a sepia-toned film reel playing scenes from a long-forgotten era. Sundar had temporarily shifted his base to the city, renting a quiet villa on the outskirts, surrounded by flowering trees and chirping mynas, a deliberate contrast to the high-speed, screen-glowing world he normally inhabited. He wanted peace, not just for himself, but for Savitri Amma, who now found herself suddenly wrapped in comforts she had never dared dream of. Gone were the tin sheets, the cracked floors, and the constant fatigue of housework. In their place stood soft bedding, a caretaker who prepared her meals with reverence, and daily visits from Sundar, who now spent his afternoons listening, truly listening, to stories from a life that had run parallel to his own, yet had been forged in entirely different fires. She spoke of the days when rice was scarce and water came from shared pumps, when she had saved every rupee to buy school books for his younger self, quietly placing them under his pillow with a smile but no explanation. He had never known. Sundar, despite all his accolades and executive achievements, found himself humbled in her presence. No corporate boardroom or keynote stage could compare to the weight of these moments, these raw revelations of a woman who had given so much without ever asking for anything in return. What stunned him most was her utter lack of bitterness. Even as she recounted hardship, her voice never held resentment, only grace. It was this silent dignity that moved him more than anything else. Then came the letter. It was on a rainy morning, the kind where Chennai skies shed monsoon tears and the scent of wet earth laced the air. Savitri Amma had asked to visit her old home one last time before it was demolished. The neighborhood had changed drastically. Skyscrapers now loomed where coconut trees once swayed, and traffic surged where once children played marbles. Still, the tiny structure where she had spent the last 3 decades stood defiantly, a relic of resilience amidst gentrification. She entered slowly, leaning on Sundar's arm, her feet carefully tracing the familiar cracks in the floor as though greeting old friends. Dust clung to the air, and spiderwebs claimed the corners, but in the center of the small bedroom lay a worn wooden box, sealed with a rusted clasp. "I kept this for you," she said quietly. Sundar opened it cautiously, his heart inexplicably thudding. Inside were a few items: a faded photograph of him as a boy, grinning with 2 missing teeth, standing next to her in a green saree; a tiny plastic Ganesh idol, its paint chipped from years of handling. And then, folded neatly in an old envelope, the letter. It was addressed to him, but written by his mother. With trembling hands, he unfolded it. The ink had bled slightly from time and humidity, but the words were intact. His mother's looping Tamil script greeted him with a familiarity that made his throat tighten. "My dear Sundar, if you are reading this, it means Savitri Amma has kept her promise. She always keeps her promises. This letter is to remind you, should you ever forget, that your success is not built only on your brilliance, but also on the sacrifices of those who never made it to the spotlight. Amma has been your guardian angel, though she would never claim the title. Without her, your father, and I could not have worked. You would not have had books, or time, or even peace to dream. Always remember her. Always honor the unseen hands that lift us." He folded the letter back slowly, eyes glistening with 1,000 unsaid things. Savitri watched him silently, her face unreadable, as if she had waited years for this exact moment, but had never dared to imagine how it would feel. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked softly, sitting beside her on a creaky bed. She smiled, a quiet, almost maternal smile. "Because you were meant to fly, Thambi. If I told you everything, maybe you'd have looked back. I didn't want that. I only wanted you to soar." Those words struck deeper than she could have known. All his life, Sundar had believed in meritocracy, in effort, in intellect. But now he saw what he hadn't before. Merit meant little without a safety net woven by others, often women like Savitri Amma, who bore the weight of worlds so others could build their own. That evening, Sundar made a decision. He wouldn't just support her quietly. He would create something lasting, transformative. A foundation, perhaps, but not one that simply handed out aid. It would be a platform to honor the invisible laborers, the nannies, housekeepers, drivers, and cooks, whose contributions went unseen in the glare of ambition and success. He wanted to tell the world, behind every CEO, there is a Savitri Amma. He began sketching ideas late into the night. The project would include scholarships for their children, medical aid, pension schemes, and most importantly, storytelling, a digital archive that captured their histories, their voices, their legacies. No longer would these lives be footnotes in someone else's biography. But before he could launch it, he knew he needed her blessing. When he explained it all to her, every line, every intention, she listened patiently, her eyes never leaving his. "You will do great things, Thambi," she said when he finished. "But promise me one thing. Anything. Promise me that you will sit down with them, not just fund them, not just speak for them, but sit with them. Listen, look into their eyes, understand them, like you understood me. That is what they need. Not pity, not charity, just dignity." He nodded, overcome with emotion. And so the first step was taken. A soft revolution, born not in a boardroom or a media blitz, but in a crumbling house in Chennai, beside an old woman and a faded letter. As the weeks passed, Sundar stayed in India longer than anyone expected. He met with women who had similar stories, some retired, others still working into their 70s. Each had tales of love, sacrifice, and quiet strength. He listened to them. He recorded their voices, and one by one, he began to weave a tapestry of remembrance. When he finally returned to California, he wasn't the same man who had left. And the world was about to see the impact of a heart touched by history, memory, and the enduring power of gratitude. A voice for the quiet giants. The return to Mountain View wasn't the triumphant homecoming Sundar Pichai had anticipated, not because anything had gone wrong, but because something within him had fundamentally changed. For all its modern sheen and streamlined precision, The Googleplex now felt curiously distant to him, as though the relentless march of innovation, once his life's tempo, had suddenly fallen out of sync with his heartbeat. He moved through meetings with his usual diligence, responded to stakeholder concerns, and greenlit projects, but behind the measured cadence of his words, his mind kept drifting back to a tiny house in Chennai, to the cracked cement walls that had held more wisdom than any think tank he had ever stepped into. In his absence, news of his quiet visit to India and his encounter with Savitri Amma had begun to leak into the public sphere. A few Indian media outlets had picked up the story through local whispers. An anonymous tip here, a blurry photo there. It wasn't a press stunt, and Sundar had not intended it to become one. But in a world ravenous for authenticity, the story struck a deep chord. It wasn't about Sundar Pichai, the CEO. It was about the unseen force behind the success, the 85-year-old woman who had spent her life cleaning, cooking, caring, and giving, all without once asking the world to notice. Within days, emails began to flood in. Some came from fellow executives, admitting that they too had once been raised or rescued by women like Savitri Amma. Others came from housekeepers, caregivers, and domestic workers across the world, grateful that someone had finally acknowledged their stories in a world that treated them like furniture. But the most touching messages were from children, boys and girls raised by working mothers and nannies, who confessed they had never thought of these women beyond their roles. Now, they were seeing them with new eyes. Moved by the wave of response, Sundar convened a small, secret team inside Google: coders, designers, ethicists, and storytellers. They were handpicked not just for their skill, but for their empathy. This wouldn't be a vanity project. It would be a living, breathing platform to uplift, recognize, and connect the countless invisible contributors to our lives. He called it the Quiet Giants Initiative. The platform would do more than just provide financial aid or educational grants. It would allow families to document the lives and legacies of their household heroes in their own words. Users could upload photos, record audio interviews, submit letters, or simply write about the woman or man who made a difference. Every story would be preserved, searchable, and shareable. They weren't just building a website. They were archiving a forgotten part of human history. As work on the platform progressed, Sundar realized how delicate this mission truly was. It wasn't about romanticizing poverty or painting every caregiver as a martyr. It was about honoring agency, struggle, and grace. Too often, narratives about the poor were either steeped in pity or swallowed by silence. The Quiet Giants Initiative had to walk a careful line, celebrating the spirit without erasing the reality. To ground the initiative, Sundar decided to film a documentary. Not a slick corporate promo, but a raw, heartfelt exploration of lives that had never seen a camera before. He returned to India with a small team. No PR staff, no fanfare. Over 3 weeks, they traveled across states, meeting women like Asha from Pune, who had single-handedly raised the children of 3 families while sleeping on kitchen floors; Fatima from Lucknow, who taught herself English in her 50s, just so she could help the kids she looked after with their homework; and Ruth from Bengaluru, who sang lullabies in 4 languages and never forgot a child's birthday, even after they moved away. Each interview peeled back layers of history, heartbreak, and hope. And through it all, Sundar asked just one question: what do you wish the world knew about you? The answers were never bitter. They were dignified, measured, powerful. I want people to know I chose to stay, one woman said. I had offers to leave, but the children needed me. I want my granddaughter to see this one day and know I wasn't just a maid, said another. I was a mother to many. By the time they returned, the footage was electric with emotion. Sundar watched hours of it in silence, often with Savitri Amma beside him, who would occasionally smile and say, "She reminds me of Rani from next door," or "That woman has the same strength as Pushpa I knew in Coimbatore." When the platform finally launched 6 months later, it did so without a press conference or CEO speech. Instead, it began with a single video uploaded quietly on YouTube. It was titled simply, "To the One Who Raised Me." In it, Sundar sat beside Savitri Amma in a modest Chennai courtyard. No makeup, no studio lighting. Just a man and a woman, separated by generations but bound by love. He told the story of how she carried him through his early years, not just feeding him, but shaping his moral compass. He spoke of the letter from his mother, the house, the broom she used to sweep, and the hug that felt like home after decades. He ended by thanking her, not just for what she did, but for who she was. That video broke the internet, not through virality, but through vulnerability. People began posting their own tributes. Daughters uploaded videos for their ayahs. Sons found old photos of nannies long gone. Some traveled back to their childhood homes to say thank you. And most importantly, many began looking at the people in their homes, not as help, but as human. Corporate partners started reaching out to integrate benefits for domestic workers into their CSR arms. A university offered full scholarships for children of caregivers. A tech startup created an app to connect elderly retired workers with volunteer companions. Change, once an abstract word, began taking form. And through it all, Savitri Amma watched quietly, often from a corner of the screen, smiling her soft, knowing smile. She remained humble, never quite understanding the scale of what had begun, only that Thambi was doing good work, and that she was proud. But amidst the surge of public love, there was something else unfolding, something only Sundar had noticed. Amma was slowing down. Her hands trembled more. Her voice occasionally lost its clarity. And in the rare moments when she was alone, Sundar could see her staring into the distance, as though talking to someone only she could see. He didn't say anything. He simply sat beside her, sometimes for hours, holding her hand, memorizing the lines of her face, the scent of jasmine and old books, the rhythm of her breath. Because he knew, deep down, that some stories are told in the final chapter, and the world, though it didn't know it yet, was about to learn what legacy really meant. The sun set before the sunrise. In the quiet moments of dusk, when the air turned soft and warm, and the golden hue of the setting sun poured like honey across the tiled courtyard of the Chennai villa, Savitri Amma often found herself seated in her favorite spot, an old wicker chair shaded by a flowering frangipani tree. She didn't speak much during these hours. Sometimes she dozed lightly, her breath slow and rhythmic, her fingers gently curled in her lap. Other times, she watched the birds return to their nests, eyes fixed not on the present but seemingly on the invisible tapestry of memories that only she could see. To anyone else, it might have seemed like she was simply resting. But Sundar had come to understand that this was her time of reckoning, of sorting through the endless library of moments she had lived, loved, and endured. Her health had begun to decline in a way that was subtle at first. A bit more fatigue, a shorter walk, a nap that stretched longer than usual. But soon the signs became undeniable. She no longer asked for her morning stroll. Her appetite, once marked by enthusiasm for filter coffee and hot pongal, began to wane. Even her voice, once so rich with storytelling, took on a quieter, almost whispering quality. The woman who had spent her life as a fortress of resilience was, at last, yielding to time. Sundar refused to confront it at first. He threw himself deeper into the quiet giant's initiative, as though its success could somehow forestall the inevitable. He expanded the foundation's reach internationally, launching regional chapters in Southeast Asia, Africa, and South America. He coordinated with NGOs, lobbied for domestic worker rights in countries where they were most vulnerable, and began funding documentary crews to tell these stories across language barriers. Yet, with every email sent and every milestone celebrated, his mind remained anchored to the image of Savitri Amma sitting in her chair, her eyes tracing something in the distance that he couldn't quite see. And then, one evening, as a light monsoon breeze carried the scent of fresh earth into the room, she called for him. "Thambi," she said, using the nickname she had given him as a boy. Her voice was low but unmistakably clear. Sundar came immediately, kneeling beside her chair. Her hand reached for his, brittle but warm, and she held it with the quiet intensity of someone who had made peace with the truth, but needed to pass something on before it was too late. "You've done more than I ever imagined," she began, her eyes fixed on his face. "But before I go, I want to ask something. Not for me, but for others like me. Will you promise?" "Anything, Amma," he said without hesitation, blinking back the tide rising behind his eyes. "Promise me you won't let the world forget the ones who can't speak for themselves. You gave me a voice. Now give it to the others. Not just the ones with names and photos, but the ones who've passed, who left no story, no trace, just love. Speak for them too." He nodded, overcome, unable to find words. She smiled, that same soft, satisfied smile that had carried him through his entire childhood, and whispered, "Then I can rest." It wasn't until later that night, as rain began to gently fall and the city's usual clamor softened to a lullaby of droplets, that her breath grew slow and shallow. The caregiver called Sundar immediately. He arrived within minutes and sat beside her once more, just as he had done so many times before. Only this time, he knew it was different. He didn't say anything. He didn't cry. He simply held her hand, pressed his forehead to it, and whispered, "Thank you for everything. You can go now. You don't have to hold on anymore." And she did. No dramatics, no final words, just a single final breath that slipped into the wind, as though it were returning to the stars from where it had come. The funeral was private, as she would have wanted. No media, no speeches, just Sundar, a handful of people who had known her, and a small choir of children from a local shelter she had quietly supported for years. Sundar had her buried under a frangipani tree in the garden she loved, her wicker chair placed beside it as a tribute. A simple stone was placed above the soil, engraved not with dates or titles, but a single phrase in Tamil, "Aval Oru Thadam Sidapen." She was a woman who left a path behind. But the story didn't end there. In the weeks that followed, something extraordinary began to unfold. Stories from around the world. Letters, photos, videos, and even old audio tapes began to pour into the quiet giant's platform. Many were about women just like Savitri Amma, caretakers, nannies, cooks, and guardians who had passed on long before smartphones or social media, leaving only memories behind. But now, those memories were being resurrected by grateful sons and daughters who had once taken their love for granted and were now eager to honor them in a world that finally had a space for their names. Inspired by Savitri's final request, Sundar launched the Forgotten Hands Archive, a project dedicated entirely to preserving the stories of those who were never recorded in the first place. He offered grants to families who wished to document these lives. He hired oral historians and writers, fluent in regional languages, to interview elders across villages and cities. And slowly, page by page, a new historical record began to take shape. One not of kings, politicians, or inventors, but of women who sang lullabies, cleaned wounds, remembered birthdays, and waited at school gates in the rain. The project received global recognition, not because of its association with a tech CEO, but because it touched a universal truth, that behind every success was a web of unseen labor, most often feminine, most often unpaid, and almost always unacknowledged. Sundar made it clear in every interview, this was not his legacy. It was hers. He didn't want a building named after him. He didn't want his image attached to billboards. If anything, he wanted to disappear behind the work, just as she had once disappeared into the background of his childhood, never asking for thanks, only presence. But one night, months after Savitri's passing, he returned to her garden, now blooming with fresh frangipani. He sat in her wicker chair, letting the scent wash over him. The sky above was clear, the stars bright, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to cry, not from grief, but from gratitude. He had given the world tools to connect, to search, to build. But now, because of her, he had also given it something rarer: the ability to remember. And in that quiet garden, under a moonlit sky, the legacy of a woman the world had once overlooked stood tall and eternal, not in stone or steel, but in stories, hearts, and the lives her spirit had touched. When the world begins to listen. As the first anniversary of Savitri Amma's passing approached, the project she had inspired, the Quiet Giants Initiative, was no longer a simple humanitarian gesture or a tribute bound by memory. It had become a global phenomenon. What began as one man's journey to honor the woman who had raised him had evolved into something far larger: a reawakening. From bustling cities to remote villages, from policy tables in parliaments to dining tables in modest homes, people were finally having a conversation that had remained absent for too long, about the quiet labor, almost always rendered by women, that formed the emotional and logistical scaffolding of the modern world. In India, it began with education boards agreeing to introduce short modules in school curricula about domestic workers and caretakers, not as charity cases, but as professionals, contributors to the social fabric, deserving of respect and fair treatment. Children were now encouraged to write essays, stories, and even perform plays based on the lives of caregivers, drawn not from fiction, but from their own homes and memories. It wasn't unusual anymore to hear a 10-year-old stand up in class and say, "My Amechi helped raise me. She's my hero." In Brazil, where the culture of domestic work bore deep roots tied to centuries of inequality, the government took note of the groundswell created by the Quiet Giants movement. Through a collaboration with local NGOs, they passed legislation ensuring mandatory pension plans for long-term domestic employees. In South Africa, the initiative worked closely with cultural institutions to collect oral histories from retired nannies and housekeepers, many of whom had lived through apartheid, helping raise white families, even as they were denied basic rights themselves. Their stories were finally being recorded, not just as side notes, but as central narratives of resistance, dignity, and love. For Sundar Pichai, this global transformation brought both a sense of fulfillment and a strange, quiet humility. He had once spoken at economic forums about scalability, sustainability, and systems architecture, but now he found himself in rooms where the language was different, more vulnerable, more grounded. He spoke not as a tech evangelist, but as a son, and it was in this role that he found a new voice, gentler, yet more powerful than any keynote he had ever given. He began attending roundtables not as the headline act, but as a listener. In one such meeting in Nairobi, he sat for hours with women from rural villages who had formed support networks for aging caregivers. In the Philippines, he visited homes where elderly nannies were cared for by the very children they had once raised, now adults. These were not grand affairs. There were no red carpets, no paparazzi. Just humble gatherings with tea, old photos, and the occasional sound of laughter that escaped when someone shared a tender memory of their yaya, their adji, their mommy. And all the while, the platform itself grew. Thousands of new entries were added every week. Photos uploaded from dusty shoeboxes, handwritten letters scanned and translated, voice messages recorded by grandchildren sitting on the laps of old women who had once held their entire families together. What struck Sundar most was not the sadness of these stories, but their warmth. These were not eulogies. They were love songs, songs long unsung, now finally heard. At the Googleplex, some executives struggled to understand the shift. This wasn't a data-driven expansion. There was no monetization model. Some asked, "What's the ROI?" Others wanted to package it into a marketing campaign. But Sundar stood firm. He had spent decades building algorithms and business models. Now he was building memory. It wasn't that he had stopped believing in technology. On the contrary, he believed in it more than ever, but only when it served humanity, not distracted from it. He began to challenge his own teams differently. Could machine learning help identify domestic workers lost to census data? Could augmented reality be used to recreate forgotten moments in family history? Could the same systems that tracked consumer behavior be used to recognize and uplift the stories of caregivers? Under his leadership, a quiet revolution was taking shape inside the company. Departments began dedicating internal resources to building tech that preserved heritage. Hackathons were organized to create apps that translated elders' oral histories into local scripts. Engineers who once focused solely on product optimization now found themselves coding for something more personal, building platforms that helped children record the voices of their aging grandmothers before they faded into silence. Then came the Global Summit in Geneva, where the UN invited Sundar to speak, not about artificial intelligence, but about the dignity of invisible labor. The audience was packed. World leaders, activists, academics, and CEOs, and when Sundar took the stage, he carried no slides, no graphs, only a small framed photo of Savitri Amma, smiling, her eyes kind and wrinkled. He began, not with data, but with a story. I once believed my story began in a small house in Chennai, where my father brought home radios to repair and my mother managed everything with limited means. But I was wrong. My story began with a woman named Savitri, who swept the floors, cooked my meals, walked me to school, and held my hand when I was afraid of thunder. She never went to college. She never got credit. But she taught me the most important lesson of all. That greatness isn't in the spotlight, it's in service. The hall was silent, not because the message was complex, but because it was undeniable. He ended with an invitation, not a call to action, but a question. Who raised you when no one was looking? And what will you do to honor them? In the days that followed, the summit's livestream went viral, not because of its speaker's fame, but because of its soul. Millions began posting under the hashtag #WhoRaisedYou. Celebrities, activists, even heads of state shared their stories, often for the first time. The narrative was shifting, away from individual glory, toward collective memory. And through it all, Sundar never stopped returning to Chennai. Every 6 months, like a ritual, he visited the small garden where Savitri Amma rested. The frangipani tree now stood taller, its blossoms falling like quiet blessings onto the soil below. The chair remained, though weather-worn, untouched. He never sat in it. It wasn't his to sit in. Instead, he brought her stories, updates, photos of new chapters in the archive, letters from children she had never met, but who now called her Patti, grandmother. There, in that garden of remembrance, Sundar Pichai, one of the most powerful figures in technology, sat not as an innovator, but as a grateful child. And in the stillness of those moments, beneath the canopy of a tree that had once shaded the final days of a remarkable woman, he discovered what it truly meant to build something eternal. Legacy in the language of the heart. By the second year of the Quiet Giants initiative, Sundar Pichai found himself no longer just managing a project, but stewarding a movement. What had once been born from the quiet garden, where Savitri Amma spent her final days, had now taken root in the very structures of global consciousness. What struck him most was how the movement hadn't simply added to the world, it had begun to shift it. Not through riots or revolutions, but through remembrance, through rediscovery, and through the slow, undeniable power of dignity reclaimed. There was a kind of poetry in how the platform evolved. Its original interface had been simple, almost skeletal, a place to upload photos, documents, and short stories. But over time, it became something much more intimate. The engineers had introduced a feature Sundar was particularly fond of: memory threads. These were timelines that allowed families to string together moments from a caregiver's life, not just as data points, but as experiences. It allowed for scanned grocery lists, recipe notes in fading ink, old voicemails, or even a particular piece of cloth that had been sewn into every birthday dress. Each object became a story, each story a part of history, and history was where the next phase of the mission began to focus. Sundar had grown increasingly aware that memory, when undocumented, could be erased, not maliciously, but passively, as generations moved forward and old knowledge fell through the cracks. He began assembling a global advisory board. Historians, sociologists, anthropologists, and community elders from over 20 nations. Together, they proposed a bold plan: the Caregiver Archive Project, a worldwide effort to document and digitize the untold stories of domestic workers from the 19th century onward. No longer would caregivers be footnotes in the biographies of prominent families or reduced to the maid in dusty journals. This would be their restoration. To support the project, Sundar diverted funds from one of Google's most profitable AI verticals. It wasn't a popular decision inside the company. Some saw it as a sentimental detour from the hard logic of business. But Sundar remained unshaken. He often responded with a simple truth: if we can build models that predict consumer choices down to the minute, then we can afford to build models that preserve the lives of the people who made those choices possible in the first place. Simultaneously, policy discussions were beginning to take shape. Inspired by the cultural momentum, UNESCO proposed a new framework for care heritage recognition, which would allow nations to recognize caregiving contributions as intangible cultural heritage. It would mean that the role of a nanny in Mumbai, a domestic helper in Jakarta, or a grandmother caretaker in Ghana could be protected and honored under the same banner as ancient oral poetry, traditional crafts, and indigenous rituals. Sundar was invited to co-author the policy's preamble. He did so not from a conference room, but while sitting on the same wicker chair in Chennai where Amma had once watched the sunset. His days had begun to change in rhythm. He still attended quarterly reviews, still met with product leads, but the heartbeat of his life now came from quieter places. Letters from school children who had interviewed their ayahs and written poems in their names. Elderly women in care homes who were now receiving pensions for the first time because their employers, now aware and moved, had chosen to honor them properly in their final years. He even received a message from a university in Japan, where a professor had designed a course called Silent Builders. The global impact of domestic work, inspired entirely by the stories on the platform. What surprised him most wasn't how much the world embraced the movement, but how deeply it began to affect him. It wasn't a transformation that arrived all at once. It was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, like light slipping into a room beneath a door left slightly ajar. He started taking walks without his phone. He sat longer with people in silence. He listened, not to respond, but to absorb. He began writing letters again, by hand, to friends he hadn't seen in years. His daughter noticed the change first. "You smile more," she told him one afternoon, "like Amma used to, when she tucked me in." That small sentence was enough to still him completely. In her words, he heard the full arc of legacy, how one woman's presence had not only shaped him, but now shaped how his children would remember him. At a family gathering later that month, as cousins and relatives spoke about their own memories of Savitri Amma, something remarkable happened. His niece, a shy 14-year-old, stood up and read a short story she had written about a fictional character based on Amma, a woman who could see memories in people's eyes and plant hope like seeds in their hearts. When she finished, there was no applause, just silence, deep and still, like the earth listening. Afterward, Sundar stepped outside and looked up at the sky. It was twilight, the same hour Savitri Amma used to call God's painting time. He imagined her standing beside him, arms crossed, a soft smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. And in that still moment, it became clear that this journey, what began as a search for one woman, had never been about charity or even justice. It had been about belonging, about anchoring the future in the truth of the past, about making sure that when someone whispered your name decades after you were gone, it wouldn't be followed by silence, but by a story. He returned to work with a new idea. Not a platform, not a campaign, but a school. A global institute dedicated entirely to the study and preservation of caregiving cultures. Interdisciplinary, accessible, rooted in lived experience. It would host seminars, offer certifications, and train new generations in the ethics of care, not as a profession of last resort, but as one of the highest forms of leadership. For what is leadership? Sundar often thought now, if not the ability to serve with humility, to hold others before oneself, to endure without asking for applause. He named the school the Amma Institute of Care and Memory, after the woman who had given him everything and asked for nothing. And in the opening ceremony, held in a sunlit courtyard surrounded by marigolds, he quoted her directly, in Tamil, Ellarakam oru idam ventum. Nam marakapada nilayil uruka kudathu. Everyone deserves a place. We should not live and die in forgetfulness. The world, once obsessed with metrics and margins, was beginning to understand something deeper. That perhaps the future wasn't in acceleration, but in remembrance. That maybe the true revolution was not speed, but stillness. And in that stillness, the world was beginning to heal. The light that never leaves. The Amma Institute of Care and Memory stood like a quiet monument on a gentle rise outside Chennai, its architectural form echoing not power but peace. It was constructed not of gleaming steel or glass, but of warm stone, earth-toned clay, and reclaimed wood, designed to breathe, to feel, and to reflect the spirit of those it honored. The gardens bloomed with marigolds, frangipani, and jasmine, plants chosen not for their prestige, but for their memory. It was here, under the expansive banyan tree at the center of the courtyard, that the stories lived, etched into the walls, spoken in lectures, whispered during shared tea between generations who had finally found a space that understood them. In its first year, the Institute welcomed not only researchers and students, but also hundreds of caregivers from around the world, some retired, some still working, some barely able to articulate what they had spent their lives doing, because until now, no one had ever asked. They came with calloused hands, weathered photographs, and hearts full of silence that finally, at long last, were invited to speak. There were lectures on the anthropology of motherhood, workshops on intergenerational trauma and healing, exhibits showcasing domestic artifacts as cultural treasures, and symposia where AI researchers collaborated with oral historians to preserve voices in ways never before imagined. This was not academia for its own sake. This was academia rethreaded with soul. And through it all, Sundar Pichai walked not as a founder to be celebrated, but as a witness to something much greater than himself. He often came without announcement, slipping quietly into the back of lecture halls, or sitting beside old women in the tea garden, asking them about their childhoods, the gods they prayed to, the meals they remembered best. No cameras, no headlines, just listening, just learning. One evening, as twilight kissed the edges of the horizon, he sat in the meditation circle just outside the main hall. The wind was soft, the scent of jasmine thick in the air, and the murmur of the wind through the trees reminded him of Amma's voice. Calm, gentle, unwavering. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small item, worn with time, her Ganesh idol. It was the same one he had found in her wooden box years earlier, chipped and faded, but still whole. He placed it gently on the stone altar and sat beside it. It was in that silence, surrounded by the legacy she had inspired, that Sundar finally allowed himself to feel the fullness of her absence and presence. It wasn't grief anymore. It wasn't sorrow. It was something deeper, a profound, enduring gratitude. Everything he had become, everything the world was now slowly becoming, had roots in her grace. He whispered a prayer, not in any language known to institutions, but in the language of the heart, the kind that speaks through memory, through devotion, through the act of remembering itself. Not long after, Sundar's daughter, now a young woman with her own dreams and her own strength, began working at the Institute. She didn't enter through privilege or pedigree, but earned her way through a project she had launched independently, a series of children's books inspired by caregivers' stories from the platform. Illustrated by artists from villages across India and written in multiple languages, they became a global phenomenon. Titles like The Woman Who Woke the Stars, Potty's Mango Tree, and The House That Laughed were not just bedtime tales. They were bridges between generations, between cultures, between the unsung and the celebrated. At one of her readings, a child raised his hand and asked, "Are these stories real?" She smiled and said, "They're more than real. They're remembered." That phrase stuck with Sundar. He repeated it later during an interview with a European broadcaster who had come to the Institute expecting to document a philanthropic venture and instead found themselves weeping mid-interview. They're more than real. They're remembered. In that line was the crux of the mission. Not charity, not reform, but remembrance, the kind that transforms the forgotten into the foundational. As time passed, Sundar slowly began stepping back from the daily operations of Google. He remained involved, of course, but his heart was here now, at the crossroads of legacy and memory. He was no longer concerned with becoming the most quoted name in tech history. He wanted to become the quiet echo in someone's heart that whispered, "You matter. Your story matters." The final tribute came 5 years after Amma's passing, during the unveiling of the Institute's Memory Sanctuary, a living archive where visitors could walk through curated rooms modeled after actual homes where caregivers had lived and worked. Every item, from the red-stained almirah in a Kolkata kitchen to the stone pestle used in a Sri Lankan household to crush spices, was sourced with reverence, each one carrying a plaque, not with a price tag or artistic summary, but with a quote from the person who had once used it. One room was a replica of Sundar's childhood home. In the corner sat her chair, the same one they had carried from the garden where she spent her last days. Above it, framed in warm wood, was the letter his mother had written, weather-worn but carefully preserved. Below it, a plaque read, "She never asked to be remembered, but we remember anyway." As people passed through, many wept, not out of sorrow, but out of recognition. They saw their own histories in that room, their own elders in that chair, their own unspoken gratitude in every object. And in that shared reflection, something sacred took place, the reclaiming of emotional heritage, once buried beneath the noise of modern life. In the closing ceremony that day, Sundar stood on a small platform surrounded by caregivers, children, students, and world leaders. He didn't give a long speech. He simply held up the Ganesh idol, now housed in a glass dome beside Amma's chair, and said, "This is not an ending. This is an inheritance. The world we build from here must not only be intelligent, it must be kind." He stepped down quietly, disappearing into the crowd, just as she had once disappeared into the background of his life, not for lack of presence, but because that was her nature, to serve without needing recognition. But now recognition had come, and with it, reverence. As night fell and the temple bells from a nearby village chimed softly in the wind, Sundar looked up at the stars. Somewhere between them, he imagined, Amma was watching, not proud, for she had never cared for pride, but at peace. And in that peace, the world had found a new direction, not in code, not in capital, but in care. Because in the end, it wasn't the machines that taught us how to love. It was the women who held us when we cried, who whispered stories into our sleeping ears, who stood unseen in kitchens, doorways, and schoolyards, watching over us, even when we had forgotten they were watching. And now, finally, the world remembered.